talking a little bit about what our foundational understanding is of stalking. And so we use both a behavioral definition and a legal statutory definition. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that although each state has a statute regarding stalking, unfortunately, they're all very different. And so what happens is sometimes people are very tied to their statutory definition, and they don't necessarily have a good grounding in what the behavioral definition looks like, which really affects our ability to be able to interact with victims. So one of the things that you should all know is that my background is in advocacy. I was an advocate for 11 years in a rural domestic violence and sexual assault program in Nebraska. So I always love treating all of you because you are my people, and we have a good understanding of one another and how we interact. And one of the things that I have found out is as I've progressed in this field and worked for over 25 years now, doing stalking and sexual assault and domestic violence work, is that oftentimes we want to know from a training what's actually going to affect the work that we do. And so I'm hoping that today I'm not only just giving you information about stalking, but I'm also giving you things that you can use in your work with victims. So please, if you have questions, use the chat box. We can always try to unmute you all so we can interact with one another. But I want to make sure that our time that's spent together is well spent. And one of the things that I know is that when I started as an advocate and I was well versed, I thought, in the domestic and sexual assault field, that I didn't have a really great understanding of stalking. And that a lot of times I was basing that particular interaction on what our particular state statute said. And unfortunately, every single state statute is different across the US. Some of them are better than others. A lot of them need updating. So really what we try to focus on is what we call the behavioral definition of stalking. And you're going to see it mirrored in your, for instance, in the harassment statute that Sarah just showed you. But we say that stalking is a pattern of behavior, or what some people refer to as a course of conduct, that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. But I want to break that down a little bit for all of us, because I think that definition is something that many of us have heard, but not necessarily had the time or space to really delve into. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that we refer to stalking as a pattern of behavior, or what many of you will see in a state statute says a course of conduct. The thing to remember is that stalkers are super creative. They change their tactics all the time. So when we say it's a pattern of behavior, we don't necessarily mean that the tactic has to repeat itself. So 2 phone calls, 2 text messages, 2 incidents of somebody showing up in person, but rather the entire course of behavior. So we can still have a pattern of behavior if it's 1 text message, 1 incident of the offender showing up in person, 1 incident of the offender, contacting or trying to access the victim's social media. That's still considered a pattern, even though the individual tactics are different. We also say that stalking is directed at a specific person, but all of us who have worked with victims of stalking know that that stalking often spills over to other people. So anybody that the victim has an emotional attachment to is a potential target from the stalker. So the victim's family, their children, their coworkers. And then we say it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And one of the things that we need to keep thinking about is oftentimes when victims of stalking are interacting with us, what they're communicating to us is not necessarily the feeling of fear. They might be frustrated, they might be angry, they may be experiencing kind of a flat effect because it's been going on for so long that they think nobody will believe them. And so they've just kind of learned to deal with it in their life. So what we need to keep in mind is that oftentimes when stalking victims are interacting with us, they will not articulate that they feel fear. We might not see those particular emotional reactions as fear. And it's really important to remember that things like anger and frustration are typically masking the feeling of fear. So while we might not have a person who articulates fear, many times they're experiencing fear. It's just coming across as anger or frustration. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Some of you are saying you can hear me over the computer audio, but not over the phone audio. And Sarah, otherwise, Adobe's really playing with us today, guys. Sorry about that. All right. What we also have to remember in stalking cases is that context is really critical. That many times when we are interacting with victims, we are only getting a small, what I would say, trailer of the entire movie. And it's different for us as advocates because typically we might have more time and space to be able to interact with a victim than, say, for instance, law enforcement or someone else in the criminal justice system might. But even then, oftentimes victims are only recounting a very small piece of the entire course of conduct or pattern of behavior that they're experiencing. So it's really important to keep in mind that sometimes victims are articulating things that those of us on the response side of things look at that particular behavior and think, I don't really understand why that's scary, or that doesn't really seem like such a big deal. I'll give you an example. We had a victim one time contact us through dispatch. I happened to be in the law enforcement office that day when she called, and she was very upset and crying and almost to the point of being labeled hysterical by other people. And she said that somebody had left a cup of coffee inside of her car. And dispatch's reaction is kind of a roll eyes and like, seriously, you're calling 911 because someone left coffee in your car? And what was actually happening is that victim had relocated across the country away from an abusive ex-husband, thought she was in an area where no one would be able to figure out where she had moved to. And she had come out to her car, and inside of her car was a cup of coffee labeled with the pet name that her ex-husband used to call her. And the coffee is still warm, and it's made the exact same way that she always takes it. And so she knew that the offender had found where she had relocated to. What she articulated to law enforcement when she called was that somebody left a cup of coffee in her car, which if we didn't understand the context of that particular situation, we would have struggled to figure out why was that such a big deal. And although that's a pretty egregious example, what we see all the time in stalking cases is that same thing, where something happens to a victim that means something to the victim, that scares the victim, that the offender knows will elicit an emotional reaction in the victim, but to the rest of us, we're not really sure what it means, or it seems pretty benign, like it's not that big of a deal. And so what we have to keep in mind in stalking cases is that context is extremely critical. The other thing that can be difficult in stalking cases is that oftentimes the individual behaviors that are happening are not criminal behaviors. So we may have a victim who accesses our services or comes in because the offender keeps showing up someplace where the victim's at. Say, for instance, at the victim's gym or at the grocery store that the victim frequents. And the victim is upset by that and wants to, say, for instance, apply for a civil protection order or wants to talk about safety planning. And we all think it's the gym, it's the grocery store. Like the offender, it's probably a coincidence that they showed up there. Or we're all adept enough to realize that it's probably not a coincidence that the offender showing up there, but that person showing up in and of itself is not a criminal activity. It's not a criminal activity to send somebody a text message, to drive by somebody's house. It only becomes criminal when it becomes part of the pattern of behavior of a stalking case, which can be problematic because what happens many times is victims contact law enforcement or they come in for services. They realize that the individual tactics that are happening might not be criminal, or they're told that by law enforcement, and then they don't report anything else because we don't necessarily take the time and space to look at all the behaviors that have been happening in a stalking case. And what's really important to consider when we're advocating on the behalf of stalking victims is that oftentimes we only know the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening. And when we interact and we talk with victims of stalking, what we know is they oftentimes have other information that they're not sharing with us. And when we ask victims later, like, why did you not bring that up to law enforcement? Or why didn't you mention that in your civil protection order petition? Their answer is, because no one asked me. So unless we're asking about these particular behaviors and really delving into all the things that happen in these particular cases, we're not going to get an accurate picture of what the victim is enduring in these stalking cases, and we're not going to be able to increase victim safety, and we're not going to be able to hold the offenders accountable for what's happening. So keep in mind that The context is really important, and that oftentimes we are taking these individual behaviors that are not criminal in and of themselves and trying to make a stalking case out of it. So keep all of those things in mind. Any questions so far over anything that we've covered? I see a couple of people typing, so I want to wait and see. Okay. So one of the things, and this is where I always hate being online versus in person. It's so much nicer when I can see all your beautiful faces and be able to interact with you. But one of the things that we know is that oftentimes when we are doing domestic violence and sexual assault work, that we hear from advocates and those involved in the system saying, yeah, Jennifer, I mean, but we see so many victims of sexual assault. We just don't see that many stalking victims. When we know that the prevalence rates of stalking are almost as high as that of sexual assault. So we know that it's about 5 million women and about 2 million men that experience stalking in a 1-year period across the United States. And that breaks down into about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men who experience stalking. If the prevalence rates are that high, why is it that we are not seeing that number of individuals accessing our services or accessing the criminal justice system? Any ideas? Ron, unmuted. I can see a couple of you typing, so I don't want to give you my ideas before I have a chance to hear what your ideas are. Any reason why, if the prevalence rates are so high, we're not seeing that number of victims come through our office? Or maybe you are. And if you are, tell me. Yep. So Sam said, I think people are often experiencing gaslighting and unsupportive responses from someone, and so they don't continue to come forward, or the victims don't think that there's something that can be done to help them, so they think there's no point in actually reporting it. Yeah, and people not knowing what stalking behavior is or knowing that there are services. That's actually one of the huge things that we see, Chloe, is that oftentimes victims of stalking aren't sure where to go for help. So think about your own agency, or if you're a dual agency or if you're a standalone rape crisis center, how do you communicate with your community that you provide services to victims of stalking? Is it named on your website? Do you have brochures about stalking? Is it something that's included in your name? All those things. One of the things that we find oftentimes is that victims of stalking don't know where they're supposed to go for help. Say, for instance, if you have a service agency that's called Family Crisis Center, if I'm not being stalked by a member of my family, do I think I can get services there? Or if you're, rape prevention services or rape intervention services, if I'm a victim of stalking, what I understand is that I could receive services for stalking from your agency. And one of the things that we often times find, unfortunately, is that victims of stalking are screened out of domestic and sexual violence services because they lack the intimate partner relationship that's sometimes a caveat for accessing services. So think about it. If they were trying to access shelter in your area, whether that's through your agency or somewhere else, if they called at 2 o'clock in the morning and got a volunteer who perhaps isn't as well versed in stalking as you are, and they said that their boss was harassing them at work and had followed them home and they were scared and they wanted a place to stay, would they be provided shelter? Or would they be told that the shelter is only for victims of intimate partner violence and that they could call the local homeless shelter? I think we'd all like to believe that they would be screened into services, but unfortunately, for what we hear all across the country is they end up being screened out of services. So be thinking about how much training have you provided to the folks in your own office, to your volunteers, to your community about whether you provide victims of stalking services. And so think about how that's communicated, because oftentimes what people say is, oh, absolutely, we work with victims of stalking. But do stalking victims know that? Yeah, and Carl also said sometimes victims are frustrated because they assume it isn't serious enough to seek services. Absolutely, and many times they've been told that. One of the things that happens a lot of times to victims of stalking is they have become so hyper vigilant about the stalker's behavior that they are constantly looking over their shoulder. They're constantly worried about where the offender is going to show up next or what they're going to do. And people on the outside, even responders, label that hypervigilance as paranoia. That hypervigilance has kept a stalking victim alive. It should be something that's noted and celebrated, but instead, as a society, we have a tendency to say that victims of stalking are just being paranoid or that they're blowing it out of proportion. And I think that absolutely contributes to the fact that we do not see that number of stalking victims come to our office, because they feel like people aren't going to believe them or that it's not serious enough. The other thing that we know is that women are more likely to experience stalking than men. But even when we have male stalking victims, we oftentimes have male offenders, because what has happened is the offender has been stalking a female victim. That female victim gets into a new relationship, or what the offender perceives to be a new relationship. And now the stalking offender starts stalking the new romantic partner in the victim's life. So keep in mind that half the time when we have a male victim of stalking, we also have a male offender. And obviously, within an LGBT relationship, we have individuals who can be both male or female, non-binary. One of the things that we haven't done a really great job of is the research on stalking is far behind when it comes to examining the level of violence rates within the LGBTQ community. We do know that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rate of stalking, and that they oftentimes experience both sexual assault and stalking as a combo in those particular situations. But it's important to keep in mind that oftentimes across the country, people are basing their response to stalking in their response to domestic violence, which is great, but only 50% of stalking victims are in a current or former intimate partner relationship. The rest are being stalked by someone like an acquaintance or a stranger or a family member. And all across the country, whenever we do training, people say, oh, absolutely not, Jennifer. We would work with all victims of stalking. But think about it. Are victims of stalking always eligible for a civil protection order? What kind of services could they get on a campus, depending on whether they're being stalked by a current intimate partner or former intimate partner? One of the things that we see happen all the time is law enforcement has specialized folks who are trained in investigating domestic violence and sexual assault, but they've never had training on stalking. Or if they did, it was a 1-hour workshop, 3 years ago, and now they're investigating stalking crimes. Or what happens is you might have somebody who, say, for instance, calls in the fact that their tires were slashed. The responding patrol officer takes the report and then, in a typical response, oftentimes says, do you know the person who did this to you? And a victim might say, yeah, I think it was my ex-partner who slashed my tires. They go and talk to the ex-partner sometimes. Many times they don't even make contact with the ex-partner. The ex-partner says, I didn't do it. The victim has no proof. And the whole crime gets chalked up as a property crime or trespass or vandalism, and never even gets flagged, or no one even looks at it as the possibility of a stalking crime. And so oftentimes victims of stalking have interacted with the criminal justice system several times and been told that it wasn't a big deal, or they didn't have enough proof, and so they no longer access those services. And so instead they turn to all of us, right? And they're trying to figure out, how do I deal with and cope with what's happening to me on a continual basis? But we have to also be very real at looking inside our own house and our own doors about whether we are actually serving victims of stalking or whether we say we are. So keep that in mind. It's nice to see many of you say that you are working with lots of victims of stalking. So the other thing that happens is when we talk about stalking, everybody's like, well, why do stalkers stalk? And my kind of tongue-in-cheek sarcastic response is, well, if I knew that, then we would market it nationwide, we'd come up with a treatment program, and we wouldn't have any problems with stalking. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. Many times what we see is stalkers are stalking because they're seeking affection from somebody else. Some of them are doing it because they're engaging in power and control, which sounds like domestic violence, I hope, came to mind for you. Some of them are doing it because they're rejected. Others are doing it because they're obsessed with a victim. Some stalkers are doing it because they're planning to commit a crime, and that crime is sexual assault. And many stalkers are doing it because they can. And we're going to talk more about the connection between domestic violence and stalking and sexual assault in stalking in just a few minutes later on in this particular presentation. What's important to remember, though, is when we talk about stalking, victims don't necessarily think about all the behaviors that are part of the stalking experience. Responders definitely do not consider all the tactics that offenders use. And so oftentimes when we are looking at our response to stalking, we are focused on just one piece of a larger picture. And what can be super helpful in understanding stalking is referring to what we call the SLI framework. And SLI stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference, and intimidation. And this particular framework was put together by Dr. T.K. Logan out of the University of Kentucky. And she and her research partner, Robert Walker, came up with this particular model to be able to kind of frame all the different behaviors that happen in stalking cases. Has anybody seen this framework before? You can either raise your hand or let me know in the chat. Carl, that's cheating. Carl said yes on another SPARC webinar. I'm glad you remembered it. That's always good to know. And that you were brave enough to sign up for another webinar with us. So that's always a good thing. Okay. So lots of people have not seen this particular framework. And I have to tell you that this was kind of a big aha moment for me. I had done domestic violence and sexual assault work for a really long time. And I thought I understood stalking, but I didn't have a really great grasp on what it exactly all entailed. I relied on victims to be able to tell me that they were being stalked or harassed, rather than my ability to be able to identify those behaviors within the context of the other things that the victim was experiencing. And one of my challenges to all of you on this particular webinar would be to think about, when you're interacting with victims, are you able to identify that stalking has been a part of their experience, regardless of whether the victim chooses to use those particular words? And many victims will not. What we know from research is we will ask victims, are you being stalked? And they say no. But then if we describe the behaviors and we say, has somebody been following you? Has somebody been sending you unwanted text messages? Is somebody destroying your property? Then victims say, oh, yeah, absolutely, all that's been happening. But they don't identify that they're being stalked. And so if we can't identify those behaviors and label them, name them as stalking, how are we able to safety plan? How are we able to provide resources? And how are we able to identify those cases that are an increased risk for victims? Because what we know is when we have domestic violence and stalking happening, we have some of our most dangerous offenders. But if we can't understand that those particular behaviors are stalking behaviors, we're going to miss them. And victims are too. So one of the things to be thinking about is, if we look at the SLI framework, many times what happens is stalking cases only get labeled as stalking cases if they contain elements of of the surveillance piece of things. So if the offender is following the victim, if they're watching the victim, if they're waiting for the victim to show up someplace. So for those of you that are on college campuses, outside the dining hall, the library, the victim's dorm, the one building, if the victim's an education major where all the education classes are, that's pretty common for offenders to do that, to wait for the victim to show up in those locations. Or they might do things like install tracking software. They might be obtaining information about the victim, either online, through the victim's social media, through interacting with friends and family, or they're engaging in what we call proxy stalking. And proxy stalking is just a fancy way of saying they're using a third party to gain information. So that might be things like asking a victim's roommate or another person in their classes, is that person dating somebody? Where, what bar do they hang out? That type of thing. So keep in mind that oftentimes, if we're identifying that a case has stalking elements in it, it's typically because it contains the surveillance elements. And we miss, unfortunately, the LII part of SLI. So the other things that we need to be thinking about are things like victims who might experience life invasion. So that can be things like unwanted contact at home, showing up places, phone calls, property invasion, public humiliation. So it used to be, back in the old days when I started this work, public humiliation was things like, spreading rumors in the community or writing on a bathroom wall. But now that everybody has social media, it's very easy to humiliate somebody else via social media. and then harassing their friends and family. Any of this stuff look familiar in the cases that you've worked on from the life invasion point of things? The problem with the life invasion tactics is that many of them are not criminal. It's not criminal to call somebody. It's not criminal to show up someplace. It's not criminal usually to talk smack about someone else. So if you look at these particular behaviors, they aren't criminal in and of themselves. But many of them are things that lots and lots and lots of the victims that you're working with are experiencing on a regular basis. But victims don't necessarily think to include this in the course of conduct that they're experiencing. We don't necessarily safety plan around all these things. And so it's really important to keep in mind that when we're looking at these slide tactics, one of the reasons that we go through this is so that you have kind of a checklist to be able to ask victims about. So if they came in for assistance with a civil protection order, if they're looking for safety planning techniques, if they just need somebody to validate and empower them about, yes, what they're experiencing is stalking, asking them about these particular behaviors is really important. And if we're really going to safety plan with victims of stalking, we have to be asking if these things are happening. Because what happens all the time is we safety plan around what's been happening, what the victims articulated to us, and we don't safety plan around what might happen. Let me give you an example. Carl's saying, yeah, I work with lots and lots of victims who get phone calls. Now, I'm going to assume that Carl's an amazing advocate, has never ever before said to victims of stalking who are getting phone calls that they should change their phone numbers. Because what happens a lot of times is people do say to victims, well, if you're getting phone calls or if you're getting text messages, just change your phone number. Do you think that actually stops the stalking? Do you think if I'm stalking Carl and I say, someone says to Carl, just change your phone number, Carl, that I, as the stalker, call Carl, get that, I'm sorry, this number has been disconnected, and then I just give up? I just stop stalking Carl because he changed his phone number. Do we really think that it actually plays out that way? Yeah, I'm going to show up instead. You're right, Carl. You know me. I'm going to show up where you live, where you work, where you go to school. I'm not going to just stop because you changed your phone number. What if, as responders, and I know we're all advocates, so take a deep breath before I say this, because remember, I'm an advocate too, so I'm not going to ever do anything that's going to emotionally damage our victim. So hear me out. What if we say to Carl, you know what, when Jennifer calls all the time, don't change your phone number. Let her call, because maybe Jennifer's going to leave a voicemail. Maybe Jennifer's number is going to show up on your caller ID. And I'm not saying Carl has to answer that. Okay, I am an advocate at heart. Carl doesn't have to answer the messages. In fact, Carl doesn't even have to look at his phone. Carl might put the phone in a box somewhere or in a drawer somewhere, gets a new phone number that friends and family can have contacts to, and only looks at their phone when they interact with their victim advocate or when they interact with law enforcement. And instead, they use the phone to gather some of the evidence to be able to bring forward in their case at the university or in their criminal case, to be able, or in their civil case or a civil protection order to prove that I'm harassing them all the time. So sometimes we need to think about, is it strategic for victims to not disengage, to continue to keep the phone number, to continue to keep their Instagram, their TikTok account, whatever the offender is accessing, and instead use it to gather some evidence. Now, you might have some victims who are like, absolutely not. I need to change my phone number. I'm tired of this. And then absolutely, of course, we're going to advocate that that's something that they should do. We want to empower our victims. But I think it's also really important to make sure that we walk through some of those scenarios with the victim and say, for instance, to Carl, you know what, Carl, you might want to keep your phone number and let Jennifer continue to call, because when she leaves those voicemails, those are really great evidence to be able to use in the stalking case, or really great evidence that you can bring forward in your university case when you're trying to prove that Jennifer stalked you. Any questions on that concept? Is that something new for all of you? Is it something you already do? Do you have concerns about it? This is the part where you all interact with me on the chat. No one's going to interact with me, really. I know more than just Carl is on here. Help him out. I'm not teacher that's patiently going to wait. Thank you, Carl, for being brave enough to say I haven't actually suggested that to clients before. It's something to consider. Certainly, if a client has concerns about that, we're going to follow the client's concerns because remember, they know better than anybody else what the offender is capable of. But it's something to consider in these particular cases. What many people will actually do is jump to having victims disconnect, and that actually ends up isolating lots of victims. So if Carl changed their phone number and suddenly their family didn't have access to it, the school didn't have access to it, that's a big step for Carl to make. And so they might not want to make that. Instead, might want to be like, no, I don't want to change my phone number. I want to be able to keep it. Others might think that that's a good option. Yeah, so Olivia said, I've suggested that to students before when assisting with Title IX cases, more so with social accounts, not phone numbers, just to keep a log. Absolutely, Olivia. So one of the tactics might be to keep that social media account so that when the offender accesses it, we have some proof and some documentation. That can also be hard because perhaps the victim uses their Instagram account or their TikTok or whatever to be able to keep in touch with other people. And so sometimes if we say disengage, oftentimes what happens is we increase their isolation. If we say to victims, change your phone number, get off social media, they might be using that phone and that social media to interact with other people and to get the support and information that they need in their case. I see Adrian said, unfortunately, law enforcement often suggests that. Yeah, law enforcement is always quick to say, just get off of social media. And then when you walk them through the scenario that I just did, they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. So sometimes you have to be able to explain that to some of the law enforcement that you're working with. Somebody said, my client took it upon herself to change her number without talking to me, but I always tell my clients to gather evidence and document everything that will help with law enforcement and the DVP process. Yeah, so that's super common, and we can always just then plan, next and be like, sounds like you changed your phone number for safety reasons. One of the things you might want to consider is not getting off Instagram or not. That way we're not victim blaming, but reiterating that they took some power in their own hands and some of the potential consequences of doing that. Yeah, and Alice said, absolutely, it's difficult for students to afford multiple cell phone numbers to be able to keep the old ones live. Absolutely. I know that financially that's not a resource for lots of folks to be able to get a new phone number or even be able to have two phones. I mean, most of us who are working and able to, supposedly be financially responsible can't afford to be able to get two phones as well. So a lot of times that might not be an option. Sometimes we have victims get a cheap throwaway phone from Walmart or something for a temporary basis with a new phone number so that they can feel safe accessing their friends and family. And they keep their old phone until the case comes to an end. But we know a lot of times when we're involved in these technology cases, sometimes law enforcement wants to take their phone or something like that, and that's really difficult. The other thing that we need to be thinking about is somebody suggested blocking the phone number. Absolutely, that's an option as well. Just talking through victims about, once you block the phone number, you're not going to have the evidence on your caller ID or evidence with voicemails, but many victims aren't wanting the evidence. They just want the emotional support. So then that's not a concern. So great point on that one as well, April. It's all depending on what our client or the victim that we're working with wants as an outcome, right? So let's also talk about the other parts of the slide categories. So the interference, so financial and work sabotage, ruining their reputation, custody interference, attacking friends or family members. This one we see a lot of times happen if you're in a school setting where the offender is interfering with the victim's ability to be able to attend classes, to be able to actually concentrate in those classes, if the offender is participating in those classes. Victims feel like they can't, access services on their campus or whatever might be happening in these particular situations. Keep in mind that a lot of times the interference piece of things is one of those tactics. All of these particular tactics can be really emotionally draining on a victim, can feel very invasive. And many times when they're bringing these particular things forward, these individual things like ruining their reputation or sabotaging work or their education are things that are really difficult to prove, are things that aren't necessarily criminal in and of themselves. But for many of the victims that we've worked with, they articulate that the interference piece of things is the stuff that absolutely makes them so frustrated. It's what I often refer to as some of the crazy making behavior, gaslighting them to feel like there isn't anything that they can do that the offender can't have access to. So keep in mind that might be one of the common reactions. And then, of course, the intimidation piece of things, where you have offenders who might be damaging property. Symbolic violence can be certain things like the coffee cup. So the coffee cup that I mentioned at the beginning of the training that was left inside a victim's vehicle, that's not a violent act in and of itself, but it absolutely symbolized violence to the victim. So that's what we mean by symbolic violence. And then, of course, offenders threatening to harm themselves or someone else as well. So one of the things to be thinking about is when you look at the SPY tactics that happen, this is a great way to be able to problem solve and safety plan around these particular tactics, because what typically happens is victims come in having experienced things like property damage or phone calls, and we safety plan around the property damage and phone calls. And the minute we safety plan and the offender doesn't have access anymore, then the offender simply changes their tactics. And so now they're doing things like threatening the victim, or now they're doing things like showing up or engaging in phone calls. And we've safety planned around one thing, but not the things that the offender might do in the future. So it's really important to be able to talk to victims about all these ranges of behaviors and saying, okay, so if you've decided that you're going to get off of Instagram, what do you think the offender will do next? How do we safety plan around that? And this is a great cheat sheet for being able to ask about all the things that they've experienced if they're trying to make a criminal report, a report through their school system or college, university, or if they're trying to fill out, say, for instance, a civil protection order. Any questions on the fly strategies before we move forward? All right. So how many of you, by raise of hands, are in dual agencies? You're doing both domestic violence and sexual assault work? Or you can put it in the chat too. Lots of you. Okay. So hang on, if you're not doing intimate partner violence or domestic violence work, this is still going to apply to you because so many of the victims you are seeing are in intimate partner relationships. But one of the things that we want to be able to concentrate on is within the context of domestic violence, we often miss the stalking piece of things. So for example, many of you are probably familiar with this power and control wheel. Obviously, it can be problematic in that it's quite old as a teaching tool. It's pretty heterosexual based. It's pretty white centric, but it's still a teaching tool that lots of folks use. And one of the things that happens is we've done so much training and understanding on domestic violence with our community, with our other criminal justice folks, with our universities, that we have gotten really adept at being able to say that when offenders and victims are in an intimate partner relationship and the offender is really jealous and they're really controlling and they monitor the victim's social media and they prevent the victim from having outside contact and they sabotage their educational career, we've all been really fantastic about saying that those are coercive controlling behaviors, that they're part of domestic violence, that they're part of the offender's MO, and that it's something that lots of victims of domestic violence experience. What we haven't done a really good job at is identifying that those are also stalking behaviors. What happens many times is when victims and perpetrators are still together, we label those behaviors as intimidation, emotional abuse, jealousy, possessiveness, control, and we don't call them stalking. But the minute the victim tries to leave the offender and the offender monitors their social media and they show up at their work and they interfere with their education, then we say, oh, that's stalking because they're no longer together. It was stalking while they were still together. And it was domestic violence. It can be both. It's not one or the other. What happens many times is we label those as domestic violence behaviors, which is fine. And some of you might be like, who cares what we call it, Jennifer? Why does it matter? It matters because if we don't label those as stalking, if we don't understand that those are stalking behaviors, we miss the opportunity to intervene in our really highly lethal domestic violence cases. Because our intimate partner stalkers are the ones that are going to be more likely to physically approach our victim. They're the ones that escalate really quickly and oftentimes use weapons in these particular cases. And there are offenders who are going to keep reoffending because they feel a right to do so. And if we don't identify that stalking is part of the domestic violence, we also miss the opportunity to be able to adequately safety plan because what we know is that in intimate partner violence cases, no, this slide is wrong. It should be in 85% of attempted and 76% of completed femicides, stalking has occurred in the year prior to the attack. So what that means is when we have victims who are murdered by their intimate partner, many of them, 85% and 76%, have been stalked within the year prior to when they were murdered, but we didn't identify it as stalking until after they were killed, or we didn't adequately safety plan around it. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is that stalking is a lethality factor. If you are working on intimate partner violence cases, if you have a victim who is experiencing domestic violence and stalking, they are at a threefold increase of being murdered by their partner. Are there questions about that? So if we don't identify it as stalking and we don't talk about it as stalking, how do we adequately safety plan? And we might have another charge that could be entered in a criminal case. It could be domestic violence and stalking. You can charge both. I see a couple of you typing, so I don't want to move on before. The difficulty is oftentimes we don't identify stalking within the context of domestic violence, and we don't adequately do a threat assessment when it comes to stalking cases. How many of you, and I would love it if you would type in the chat if you are, use a threat assessment in your work with domestic violence victims? And if you don't work with domestic violence victims, if you work with sexual assault victims and you're using a threat assessment, please tell me that as well. How many of you are using a threat assessment? So it might be things like the danger assessment by Jacqueline Campbell. It could be some communities are using the lethality assessment protocol, what people refer to as the LAP. Others are using, I'm trying to think of the other big ones. The Mosaic method is pretty popular on college campuses as a threat assessment tool. Any threat assessment tools that all of you are using? DLEG. I'm not familiar with that one, Carl. And Leslie's saying a lot of times law enforcement will charge a violation of a protection order instead of stalking. They could be charging both, Leslie. That's one of the things that we oftentimes, when we're doing training with law enforcement and prosecutors, is to get them to think about charging both. If it's a violation of the protection order, it's also usually a stalking charge. Or what happens a lot of times is they can charge both, and then, as happens in the criminal justice system, one of them gets dropped, but at least they've originally charged the stalking, so that if they get a violation of the protection order, they also have grounds many times to elevate it from a misdemeanor to a felony offense, or they have their first course of conduct in being able to prove a stalking charge. I absolutely agree, Leslie. Okay, so DLEG is the danger and lethality one that I mentioned. Okay. Any other ones that anybody's using? So one of the things to be thinking about is when we do threat assessment and we're looking at risk assessment, that one of the things that I will always reiterate and stand on my soapbox to say is that victims' perceptions of risk are always going to be better than any tool that you come up with. Okay, all those risk management tools that you all mentioned are fantastic. Okay, they do a great job in domestic violence cases, but they never replace a victim's intuition. Victim's intuition is always a better predictor. How many of you were familiar with the fact that there's actually a stalking risk assessment that's available to folks? Has anybody ever used it before? No fair if you've been on a previous SPARC webinar. Anybody using a stalking one? Yes. Leslie, which one are you using? Are you using Sharp? See a bunch of you are typing, so I'm going to wait for your answers. So for some of you, it might be, yay! Okay, so Sarah's letting me know that they included Sharp in the Stalking Awareness Month resource kits that they put out. Awesome. And some of you may have had the ability to already use Sharp. Some of you may have not had the ability to already use Sharp. But Sharp stands for the Stalking Harassment Assessment Risk Profile. And it's something that SPARC recommends as the risk assessment that you use in stalking cases. And I have a couple really great things to tell you about Sharp. Number one, it's free. Yay! Okay. All of us who have worked in nonprofits know how important that is. And number two is it creates a really great way to have conversations with victims. So what I have found beneficial about SHARP is that it kind of gives a touchstone to victims. So sometimes victims will come in and be like, oh, it's no big deal. You know, this is just something this person does. I'm tired of it, but they'll leave me alone. It can be a really great touchstone for victims and saying, actually, you're experiencing 8 out of the 14 risk factors, and these are the things that we should safety plan around. The other thing that's really nice is it gives us both a narrative report and safety planning suggestions as part of the tool. So when you fill out the tool, it will actually give you a narrative that says, you know, Jennifer and Steve have been in a relationship for X number of years. Jennifer left, blah, blah, blah. This is what we see as the risk factors in Jennifer's case. She has 9 out of 13. And then it also gives me safety planning suggestions. So it would say things like Jennifer should consider the fact that she works at night and, you know, walks out to her car at night and in a dark parking lot, and she should consider X, Y, or Z. So it gives you safety planning suggestions as well as a narrative report. So this could be super useful in when you're putting together university reports. It can be very useful in trying to gather and condense all the information that you might need for a civil protection order application. And it can be really great to provide victims as a touchstone and a safety planning guide for them regarding their particular situation. So to do this SHARP assessment, you just go to coercivecontrol.org. And it says enter a profile, and you can go there and actually play around with it before you use it when you're working with a victim. Thanks, Sarah. Sarah put the link in there for us. So you can actually go there, and one of the questions it asks you is if you are doing a test. So you can go on there and just test it out for some of the cases that you've worked and gather some information just so you can become familiar with the questions. There are lots of questions on it. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's 45 or 48. But keep in mind, it will not take you a long time. There are yes, no, there's scale questions. So it takes me about 10 minutes to do a SHARP assessment. Obviously, I'm pretty familiar with it. But if you're just doing it for the first time, it shouldn't take you more than 15 minutes. And you will find it 15 minutes very well spent. And you can do it with or without the victim. So you can do it just based on what you know about the case, or you can do it with the victim sitting with you, if that's something you prefer. So SHARP actually looks at risk factors, and it looks at kind of 4 buckets of risk factors. It looks at the big picture of things, what the stalker's mindset is, what the stalker's history is, and how vulnerable our victims are. So it looks at these kind of 4 buckets of things, and it's going to assess these things. So in the big picture, and I'm going to break these down in just a second, so don't worry about not being able to follow along, because I'm going to break each of them down in just a minute. But under the big picture, it looks at the course of conduct, which is the SLI strategies, the escalation and nature and context of the threats, and then we're analyzing the stalker's motive, if they have access to weapons, how persistent they've been, if they've been in abusive relationships before, if they have a criminal justice history. And then we're also looking at how vulnerable our victim is. Is our victim living on campus? Do they not have family control? Do they work with the offender? Do they go to school with the offender? Are they homeless? Are they not having access to resources? All of those things. So for the big picture, it looks at the course of conduct. So it goes through the SLI tactics that we just talked about and asks questions about whether victims are experiencing those particular things within the SLI framework. And it also looks at the escalation of the case. Have things become more frequent? Is the contact escalating? And if there's threats, what are the nature and context of those particular threats? Those of us that have been doing this work for a really long time know that threats are super common in domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking cases. But what's the nature of those threats? What's the context of what the offender is threatening? Are they threatening to harm themselves? Are they threatening to harm other people? Are the threats really specific? Because obviously the more specific they are, the more threatening they can be. And then the assessment looks at what the stalker's motive is. Most of us who've had the pleasure of working with stalking offenders know that stalkers oftentimes say that everything was just a coincidence, that the victim is blowing things out of proportion, that they just wanted to talk to the victim, that they just wanted to engage in a romantic relationship. This looks at the offender's motives for doing so. Are they trying to get back together with this person? Are they obsessed with this person? It looks at whether the offender is using those outside third parties, so proxy stalking, if they have access to weapons, and how persistent they've been. So do we have an offender who's violating court orders? Do we have an offender who's been charged with something and is continuing to stalk the victim? Has the victim said, leave me alone, and the offender's continuing? And we're going to talk about engagement in just a minute and disengagement, because a lot of times victims will continue to have contact with the offender and engage with the offender because they're safety planning. And that's frustrating to the system. Whether you're a university system or a criminal justice or civil justice system, many times people are frustrated by victims who continue to have contact with offenders. And that's something we need to get much more adept at being able to explain why that happens. And I'm going to give you some ideas in just a second. We're also looking at the offender's history of partner control. So have they been abusive with other folks in the past? Have they been in violent relationships or abusive with other people? So how are these the offenders that are also getting in bar fights or have assault charges? What's their criminal justice history? And one of the important things to keep in mind is many stalking offenders do not have a criminal justice history. And that's surprising to a lot of people. And then it also looks at the offender's substance use and their mental health status. One of the questions that we get a lot is that many people assume stalking offenders have mental health issues. And most stalking offenders do not have mental health issues. They have issues with power and control, but they do not have mental health concerns. So it does ask questions about that, because if there are mental health issues, that might elevate the risk. And then it looks at the victim's fear level. How scared are they? What do they perceive the threat is? What the stalker's level of technology expertise is, keeping in mind that all you have to do is use Google and you can find ways to stalk somebody through the use of technology. So we don't need offenders that are super tech savvy to be able to use that technology to stalk victims. And then it looks at how vulnerable the victim is. So those 14 things are the 14 risk factors that SHARP analyzes. And if we had more time and if we were in person, we would actually go through a SHARP assessment together. What we are going to do is go through a case scenario. So in a second, I'm going to have Sarah bring up a video. We're going to watch the video. So you're probably going to need your computer sound. I'm going to mute my microphone, and hopefully it's going to come across your computer. And I don't need my microphone on because then it has a tendency to echo. So we're going to try the video and hope it works today. And then we're going to talk about the level of risk in those particular scenarios. So before Sarah starts, any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? Okay, Sarah, you can go ahead and play that first video.
And I host the Lifetime television. My name is Erin Brockovich, and I host the Lifetime television series, Final Justice. What you are about to see is a story about a crime that is misunderstood and far too often deadly: stalking. Peggy Klinke was stalked relentlessly by an ex-boyfriend. If you haven't experienced it, it's very hard to imagine the terror of what it feels like.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. You know, in the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her. Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, he was just going to persist with it.
At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it. Wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her and put her cell phone number on it and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting. That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks. Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors. Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her. Patrick's behavior was escalating and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating, and in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, "Will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?"
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen?
Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah's going to bring the PowerPoint back up. And while she's doing so, I'm going to explain to you what we're going to do. So based on what you just saw and heard, we are actually going to go through some of the buckets of the risk assessment. So we're going to look at some of those big things to see what had been happening in this particular case, what we can think about as far as safety planning, etc. So let's look at those particular factors. So if we look at the particular factors here, this is where you would all interact with me on the chat system. Please, what things did you notice within those 14 risk factors? And let's start with just the big picture first. So if we're looking at the course of conduct, which remember is the SPY strategies, and the escalation and nature and context of threats, what are some of the things that you heard on this video that fit in the big picture category? So the SPY strategies, the escalation, or the nature and context of threats. What did you hear, or what were examples of those three things. Sam is typing. Come on, the rest of you. This is a group project. Don't leave Sam hanging. Sam and April are taking our leads, I think. Anybody else? What things did you see, or what tactics? So remember, SLI stands for the surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference. What were things that you noticed? Yep. So threats keep increasing in frequency and intensity. Escalation, yep, absolutely. So the particular things that Patrick was engaging in kept escalating, absolutely. You can see a bunch of you are typing, so I'm going to wait for your answers. Isolation from friends, yep, absolutely. And from family members through intimidation. Showing up with roses and a wedding ring, yeah. Good example of escalation and invasion. But if we think about that example, Carl, one of the things that gets brought up all the time is if Patrick had done that and shown up with a proposal and a wedding ring outside of where Peggy was at, if that had been reported to law enforcement, would they have considered that as a stalking case? It would have been like, well, you know, like jilted person who didn't get accepted, or like, why is this woman so upset about somebody proposing to her? Like, that should be a good thing, right? Yep, the escalation and not giving up and isolation and looking at the context of the particular things that have happened. Other things? Yeah, exactly. Law enforcement would have thought, oh, that's so sweet, without looking at the context. Absolutely. Oh, so Sam's saying that we use the videos lots of times, and Peggy says, yeah, he took greater steps because he wasn't reacting. It seems like she's implying the lack of reaction caused escalation. No, she didn't mean to apply that somebody might be taken away, that confronting the stalker is a good thing. What we oftentimes see is the whole because she wasn't reacting. That can be taken both ways, Sam. So we have lots of people who say, oh, if the victim reacts to the stalker and interacts with the stalker, that's just encouraging them. They need to not interact at all. And other people are like, don't interact at all because that reinforces the behavior. Yeah, so she made several attempts to report, not being asked if she was fearful for her life. So keep in mind, at this point in time, there is a trial awaiting. So Patrick's awaiting stalking charges, as you all know. It takes a while for things to get through the criminal justice system. You can hear the family's frustration with what they deem to be lack of response from the system. And in actuality, the system is doing what the system does, which is hard because there's a waiting period, right? Offenders don't get arrested and go to jail and then get sentenced the next day like they do on Law and Order. It takes a while. So other things that you guys notice, how about let's look at the stalker mindset. Patrick's motive, if he's using proxy stalking, access to weapons, his persistence, past criminal behavior. And we'll let you know that Patrick did not have a criminal history. And to their knowledge at that moment in time, Patrick had not been abusive with previous partners. And I agree, Sam, it's really tough for survivors to know what to do. Yep. So getting the restraining order, the civil protection order, yeah, and then the common question, will it take a bullet before somebody takes this seriously? Yeah, we all hear that from survivors, right? Where they're like, what, the offender actually has to harm me before anything can be done? And we all feel frustrated by that, right? Especially when we might internally be thinking sometimes it takes something that people consider to be criminal for people to pay attention, and that's frustrating for all of us, right? Other ideas of things that you saw? Patrick was pretty persistent, yes? That Peggy had said, no, leave me alone. What about witness accounts? Yeah, so was there the opportunity to have witnesses be able to gather some of that information? And you heard Peggy's sister say that she had this huge binder of stuff that she had been gathering. And one of the things that we often hear as a frustration from victims is they feel like in stalking cases, they have to build their own case. That essentially they're the one that's gathering all the information, they're the one that's putting everything together. They don't have any training on evidence gathering, they don't have training on how do you build a criminal case, and yet oftentimes it is defaulting to victims to be able to build this kind of information, and that can be super frustrating. What about Peggy's vulnerability? What was going on that made Peggy extremely isolated? Anything that you can think about or things that you noted about her fear level, what Patrick's tech expertise was? Do you think Patrick was using technology in this particular case? How vulnerable do you think Peggy was? Some of you may have caught on to, and I'm thinking one of you might be typing it, so go ahead and do so, is the fact that Peggy's sister said, we didn't know if he was tapping into our phone, so we didn't want her to call us. Yeah, and Sam saying, I shuddered to think what Patrick would have done in the internet age. You and me both, Sam. Does Peggy have a safe place to live right now? Yeah, plus Patrick hired a PI. And unfortunately, most state statutes have exclusions for private investigators. So the private investigator can't be charged with gathering information, but certainly Patrick could have been charged with using a proxy stalker or using someone else to gather information. Anything else? You heard them say that Peggy had moved, that she wasn't having contact, she was trying to stay away from Patrick. Anything else that stood out to you about any of these 14 risk factors? See a couple more of you typing, so I want to make sure we can finish that discussion before we play the ending to the video. One of the things I can tell you as a side note is Debbie, the brunette sister that you see in this particular case, is a public speaker about Peggy's case and is also a web designer and a graphic designer. And so SPARC's logo was created by Debbie. Yeah, somebody said they mentioned a change in personality while they were still dating. But no explicit mention of DV. But for all of us who are domestic violence advocates, that certainly sparks a red flag for us, doesn't it, Carl? Yeah, absolutely. I noticed that one as well when the sisters mentioned that particular behavior. So I'm going to go ahead and have Sarah bring up the second part of the video, and we're going to watch that and then find out how this case concludes. I will give you a trigger warning to let you know that there is a 911 phone call from Peggy on the video. So just in case anybody has not seen this particular video, just so you know that before it's played.
After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy Stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already picked me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he says. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it now. Does he have a gun right now? He already beat my head. If you don't get here, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly, my head is stopping wet with blood. He gets in this house, he's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop it. Female. Please stop it. I actually got to kill me. Is he, ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, if you open this door, he will kill me.
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember punching a hole in one of my walls, and I just, I started crying, and I just said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to Peggy, because, at that point you just feel that I failed her, that the whole system failed her. You just feel powerless.
The doorbell rang. I saw 2 police officers. In that instant, I knew they didn't even have to come into the house because I knew what had happened. I said, just tell me, did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister? And what I was told that night was that he had found Peggy, he had shot her in the head with a gun, and then he had killed himself. I decided, you know what? Knowing Peggy's personality, Peggy would have been on a cell phone at my funeral trying to take action, trying to make something good come out of something so tragic.
All right, Sarah, thank you for playing that second part of the video. So a couple of things that I want to note as a follow-up. Number one, Debbie absolutely took Peggy's death as a step to promote awareness across the country. And so Debbie's one of the reasons we actually have Stalking Awareness Month, which was created in the month of January, because that is when Peggy was killed by Patrick. And Debbie has been a huge advocate for victims across the country. She does public speaking. And like I said, she also is a graphic designer. So the SPARC logo that you see on the bottom of the slide is something that she designed. And she works very closely with SPARC in helping create awareness. So if you haven't checked out our Stalking Awareness Month stuff, please do so. It'll be updated probably in November in an effort to get started for January 2021. But we've got Instagram posts, etc. that you can share there. The other thing that I would mention, particularly for all of you as this audience goes, is that the thing that Peggy was missing in this case was an advocate. There weren't such things as advocates for victims of stalking back in 2003 when this happened. And so I think some of the frustration her family felt with the system might have been mitigated if there was somebody that was keeping Peggy in the loop and providing some support to her friends and family. So just reiteration that you already all know that your work is extremely important. So, other comments on Peggy's video before we delve into stalking and sexual violence? So one of the things that we know is that an IPSV on here is intimate partner sexual violence, which you all are probably know, but always like to reiterate, is that when we see victims who are experiencing both domestic violence, sexual assault within domestic violence, and stalking, that many of them are seeking some type of relief. So this particular study looked at victims who are seeking protection orders, and the smallest number were experiencing just domestic violence. A higher number were experiencing domestic violence and stalking, and an even higher number experiencing domestic violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and stalking. important to note, because what oftentimes happens is we just hear about the domestic violence. Obviously, we've all gotten much better about being able to understand and identify sexual violence within intimate partner violence, but also looking at the fact that stalking still gets missed in many of these particular cases. And that we know lots of victims of stalking also experience really high rates of verbal coercion, of substance facilitated sexual assault, of penetration while they were sleeping, of sexual humiliation and degrading behavior, that oftentimes stalking and sexual violence are going hand in hand. And in fact, that a lot of our victims who are experiencing both stalking and sexual assault are from rural areas, and that they have a higher frequency of also experiencing emotional abuse, financial abuse, threats to their friends and family, etc. And so keeping in mind that when we look at these particular cases, for victims who are experiencing sexual violence and domestic violence and sexual assault, that they report a much higher rate of protection order violations. So if you're hearing all of those things, these are our offenders who are most likely going to continue to violate civil protection orders. And so really the takeaway is understanding that a lot of times stalking is associated with more physical violence and with rape, and that for lots of sexual assault victims, they're also experiencing stalking. This particular study looked at 18 to 24-year-olds. So for those of you that are working on a college campus in Title IX offices, or in the ability to be able to provide resources on campus, so you're on a campus advocacy community, keep in mind that a huge percentage of victims who are experiencing sexual assault are also experiencing stalking. And what happens oftentimes is when those sexual assaults are reported and come forward, we focus on the sexual assault piece of things because that's what we've been trained on. That's what Title IX a lot of times focuses on, and we fail to miss stalking as a piece of the pie. And so understanding that those slide behaviors might be also present when we have a sexual assault victim, because 48% of those 18 to 24-year-olds who experienced sexual assault are also experiencing stalking. But the problem is nobody asks them about the stalking. Nobody safety plans with them about the stalking. And so we miss it completely. And the way we see that oftentimes play out is we have sexual assault offenders who either planned to sexually assault the victim and are stalking them in the midst of it. They're attempting to get somebody else to sexually assault the victim as a form of revenge or retribution. They have actually sexually assaulted the victim, or they're making contact after a sexual assault and are now engaging in stalking behaviors as a way to silence the sexual assault victim and to get them not to tell their story and to not get in trouble or have accountability for their actions. These are just a couple of examples of headlines that we've pulled as far as the link between sexual assault and stalking, talking about how lots of folks are also using then social media. So what's happening is we have victims who have been sexually assaulted by the offender, and then as a form of retribution, the offender is then posting details about the victim, posting videos, posting whatever on Grindr, on Tinder, on social media sites, obviously trying to ruin the victim's reputation, but also trying to get others to engage in sexually assaulting the victim. So we have lots of victims who report that people will come up to them on college campus. They've never seen them before. They don't know them before. And they're saying like, hey, I heard you were really down for a great time. And what has happened is the offender is engaging in stalking techniques as part of the sexual assault. So keep in mind that one of your strategies, if you're a Title IX coordinator or somebody else who works on a college campus, is to also thinking about, are we in our sexual assault cases also investigating and pursuing the idea that our sexual assault offenders are probably also stalking our victims, okay? Questions about that? Y'all being troopers, because we're winding down, so hold on. So let's talk about some of the impact that has on the victims that we're working with. And what we know, lots of victims of sexual assault and domestic violence and stalking experience are huge psychological and emotional effects. Many victims of stalking are afraid of, most of, not knowing what's going to happen next. And so they don't know where the offender is going to show up, what they're going to do, how they're going to interfere with their life. And that oftentimes manifests in that hypervigilance that we talked about earlier. And that hypervigilance, unfortunately, gets labeled by lots of people as paranoia. And so when we look at providing safety for victims, it's important to, number one, always talk with victims about how absolutely I believe you. I believe what you're experiencing. I believe that you're scared. You're not blowing things out of proportion. You're not crazy. The offender is gaslighting you. Helping the victim become familiar with, what gaslighting actually is. And then focusing on how and what does disengagement look like? How do we document these particular cases? And what are the safety and support mechanisms that we need? So when I mentioned disengagement earlier, one of the things that we've gotten really good at in our domestic violence world is being able to explain the dynamics of why victims continue to engage with offenders, why they go back, or what we would better say is the barriers that keep them in that particular relationship, or why they continue to have contact. And unfortunately, we have failed to make that same really great argument and connection when it comes to victims of stalking. We know that oftentimes victims of stalking are engaging with the offender because they're safety planning. What we would want and advise victims of stalking to do is to talk about disengagement and say, I have seen, or we have seen, that when we engage with the offender, even if the offender calls 37 times and on the 38th call, you pick up the phone and tell the offender to pound sand and leave you alone, the next time the offender calls back, they're going to call back 38 times because they know you answered on the 38th time. So any type of engagement with the offender, even if it's to tell them to, leave you alone or to be frustrated or whatever it is reinforcing the offender's behavior. What is ideal is if we can have a victim communicate, ideally by writing or in a text message or somewhere that can be documented to the offender that they don't want to have any more contact. And then if the offender continues to engage in that behavior, then we kind of have that clear line in the sand. But that doesn't always happen in stalking cases, okay? We all work with human beings who are constantly negotiating for their safety, who are trying to figure out what's the best way to handle these cases. And as somebody mentioned earlier, it's hard for victims to know what to do next, right? They might try something, it doesn't work, they try something else. And many victims are having contact with offenders because they're kind of doing a temperature check. They're trying to see how mad is the offender, what have they been saying to other people, might they come over tonight, something like that. And they're having contact with offenders. And then we have law enforcement or other responders who are saying, well, if the victim's contacting the offender, that's not a stalking case. Yes, it is. Okay. Many victims are doing so because they're trying to negotiate for their safety. And sometimes we're setting them up for failure because they have children in common or something like that, and they have to be able to talk to the offender. So keep in mind, it's helpful to recommend to victims that they disengage from the stalker, but it's not always realistic. What we also have to be thinking about is our documentation of these particular cases. So many of you have mentioned, we've had victims come in with all this evidence and logs about what's going on. This particular incident log can be super helpful to you. It's on our website at SPARC, and one side of it has instructions to victims on how to keep documentation, and the other side has the log itself, where it has the date and time and description of the incident, the witness names. Some of you mentioned earlier where there are other witnesses. I think people had said about witness accounts, and if police were called, and what's the officer's name and badge number. And these can be particularly helpful because what we know is that stalking crimes often go and interact over jurisdictions. So you might have some incidents that occurred on the college campus, and so campus security or sworn campus law enforcement on the campus have one piece of information, and then the city police have another piece of information, and then another city police has more information because of incident happened over there. So keep in mind that oftentimes we have stalking cases that are cover multiple jurisdictions. And so this can be super helpful in trying to help gather some of that information. Victims will believe that if they report to one officer that every single police department in their area has that information. And that's unfortunately, as we all know, not true. So this can help gather some of that particular information if we have a victim who's interested in the criminal justice system. And lots of folks are not. So This is available in English and Spanish on our website, but it can be something that can be particularly helpful in these cases. You can change it to add your own logo or whatever you want to do with it. But also considering when we're talking about safety for victims, that we have to be able to trust victims' instincts. Victims' instincts are usually spot on, and I've found it extremely helpful to reiterate that to victims and say, trust your instincts. It's also important that when we're looking at safety plans, that our safety plans have to evolve. We always have to anticipate what the stalker is going to do next, and that's part of the reason we went over those SPY strategies, is that many times if we prohibit an offender from engaging in one tactic, they simply change their tactics. They don't stop the stalking. And so we have to always be considering what their reaction is, as well as understanding how do we help victims balance safety and freedom. Because what happens a lot of times is law enforcement, others will say, well, stop going to the dining hall, or, stop using Instagram, or change your phone number, which isolate victims and make them feel like they have no freedom or ability to go anywhere or do anything. And so how do we balance their need for freedom with also being able to talk about safety and what happens, and how do we safety plan around some of those things that you want to be able to engage in? As I mentioned earlier, always remembering that our survivors' gut instinct about their level of risk is really important, and it's vital to help our safety planning, and that as responders, we usually minimize the risk, unfortunately. So when we look at these particular situations, really focusing on some risk reducing strategies, which can be problematic because that can come across as victim blaming. So making sure that we're providing some practical tips, but helping victims understand that it's their choice about what they want to do, as well as the empowerment factor. I've found probably that piece of things with helping victims discover their coping skills and really being able to reiterate their autonomy on choosing what they want to do in these particular cases is very beneficial when you're working with stalking victims. And then helping them access resources. What are the resources that you provide to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault that can also be helpful for victims of stalking? Do you have a stalking support group? Do you have individual counselors who are really good at being able to work with stalking victims? Many times we have people on staff who are really adept at safety planning and working with victims of sexual assault or domestic violence, but don't necessarily have that same toolkit for working with victims of stalking. And so how do we help develop that toolkit? And I'm going to give you a couple of resources. Sarah and I tried to fix this slide before we started today. It does not want to cooperate. But what it says is when we talk about safety planning is starting where the victim's at. So helping figure out, what point is the victim at? What do they want to do right now? And how do we create a safe space for them? What can feel safer to them or for them? And really focusing on the strengths that they have. Acknowledging that by the time that they have come to us for safety and support, they've already probably done a bunch of things. And those things aren't working. So one of the things that I always say when I work with victims of stalking is to start with saying, what have you already done? And what would you like to do, or what would you need my help in doing? Can be really helpful. And helping them access those resources and referrals, but planning for their emotional safety. Reiterating to them that gaslighting is common from stalking offenders, and how can we help you cope with that? And absolutely, you're going to have your ups and downs. I often say that, coping with a stalking case is kind of like riding a roller coaster. There's going to be ups and downs, and some days the victim's going to feel super frustrated, and other days they're going to be feeling okay, and then something happens unexpectedly, just like with a roller coaster, and you go down again. And so helping victims understand that constant up and down emotional impact can have huge impact on their physical health, on their emotional health, that they're not blowing things out of the proportion, they're not losing their mind, is what lots of victims will say. So reiterating to that fact is really important. And it's something you're all very skilled at because you're amazing advocates. And when we advocate for our victims, helping them predict what happened. So going through those slide strategies and talking about some of the things that might happen, helping them become familiar with the reporting process or the school process or the criminal or civil process, that information helps victims regain a sense of control. And so providing that information to them helps them feel like they have something in their life that they can have control over, which is really important to victims of stalking. It's also important that we look at our collaborative response. I'm imagining that many of you have a response in your community that focuses on the collaboration within domestic violence and sexual assault, and understanding then who are we missing when we look at a coordinated response to stalking. Each of you has your own unique community, so you can think of pieces that fit in that blank piece of the puzzle, but also thinking about who else are we involving in these particular cases. If we have a coordinated response to domestic or sexual violence, are we also including stalking in that? And if you're not, why not? It would be easy to do. It's the same people. It's the same many times responders that you're working with over and over and over again. So take advantage of that to also be looking at your stalking cases. Because if we're building a coordinated community response, and I'm understanding that many of you are like, I don't have a CCR in my community. Our community would never be able to come together to do that. Or we have such a rural community, it's the same people over and over again. I'm using CCR as a very loose description. So this is, you know, a certain cop that you can pick up and call the phone to, or you know somebody at the university that you always call in these particular cases. That's a coordinated community response. Okay, so that's what I mean when we're talking about this. But focusing on risk, so using a SHARP assessment to be able to guide your interactions with victims and offenders, and doing a multidisciplinary case review and figuring out how do we integrate our approaches. The thing that can be really frustrating for lots of victims of stalking is they feel like they lucked into a good response. Like I just happened to get the one person at the crisis center who understands stalking, or I just happened to get the one officer who understands the stalking. Victims shouldn't luck into good responses. They should be able to access services from any of us at any point in time and get the same response. And does that happen in our community? And I'm going to guess not, because we lack the training and resources to do so. What we see all the time is in communities is I'll be like, how many stalking trainings have you all attended? And people say 1, maybe 2, maybe they've listened to a SPARC webinar, maybe they've never had training on stalking. And how are we including stalking in our regular, not only training internally for our organization, maybe you're the only person from your organization on the webinar today. How can you share this information with everybody else? Number one, you can email me and I'll give you the PowerPoint. But how do you share that same information? And how do you share information outside your discipline? How are you working coordinated together to think about some of those safety planning strategies to focus on training? If you want additional training, you can always request additional SPARC training. I would encourage you to first access all of the webinars that we have on our website, and to think about some of your policies and procedures. We have lots of practitioner guides on our website. So there's guides for safety planning, there's guides for advocacy, there's guides for probation and parole officers, there's guides for prosecutors on stalking. All of those things are available to you free on our website. And we're always happy to have one-on-one conversations and provide that individual technical assistance that you might need for your organization. One of the things, the only time I think that I've been brought to tears in a presentation since I've become the director of SPARC was I was at a presentation where a victim advocate said to me, how do I get other people to care about this issue? And I said, I wish I knew, because I'm trying to do that for the entire country. But each of you, just by being on this webinar, are champions, and you can do that. You can champion your community to be able to react to these particular cases. So some of the things that you might find helpful is, are you doing stalking awareness? Are you encouraging that interaction for investigation and communicating across your disciplines and your jurisdictions about those particular crimes? And how are you working with your prosecutors to hold them accountable? If you're like, oh, that's our big issue, SPARC actually sits in Equitas, which is filled with former prosecutors who do nothing but educate individuals on violence against women issues. So they can have one-on-one conversations with your prosecutors about how to build individual cases. So some of those things that you might be needing are things like getting in touch with Equitas. So this is Equitas's website. It's equitasresource.org. You can certainly access that particular website. I would encourage you to look at the prosecutor's guide on our website. So on our website, there's a prosecutor's guide to stalking that's available for folks. There's also a guide for corrections and parole. So what is your probation department doing when responding to stalking? Do they have individuals that are trained and understand how to monitor stalking behaviors after stalkers have been held accountable? Is your organization, we talked earlier about your domestic violence and sexual assault organization, how great is your response to stalking? I would encourage you to download this particular checklist. It takes you through things and says, hey, you know what? Does your website provide a link to a stalking log? Does your website provide, and does your social media cover stalking, or are you just focused on sexual assault? It will guide you through a bunch of questions to kind of take a look at what's going on in your organization. How are you communicating about the importance of stalking and communicating to victims if they look at your media to understand that you care and understand how to help victims of stalking? There's also a guide for advocates on there. So how do you respond to stalking cases? Is this something that all of your advocates in your organization have read before? Would they know how to respond to a stalking victim? Would they understand how it might be different than working with a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault? Have they safety planned with victims of stalking? Safety planning is something you all are extremely good at. This might give you some additional hints and insight into safety planning with victims of stalking specifically. So it might be something that you want to check out and review or put in your new volunteer training or your new training for advocates. And then this is our website link again. And Sarah has been amazing about linking all the things that I just talked about in the chat there. So you can certainly gather information from there. But this is a reminder about how to access our website. I would encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. We send the newsletter out. It's about quarterly, so you're not going to get spam from us, but it just highlights all the new resources. So anytime we develop a new resource, we highlight it in our newsletter. And then we talk about Stalking Awareness Month, etc. You can certainly definitely also follow us on social media. We love it when your individual advocacy organizations follow us because you can retweet and reshare our stuff. Our handle on all of those social media platforms is follow us legally. So you can get on there and follow us to hear more about information that you might want to choose through your social media accounts. And then last but not least, this is my contact information. It's usually easiest to reach me by email. I try to always respond immediately if at all possible. When the world gets back to normal, I am on a plane and in training quite frequently. But for now, I'm a lot more accessible. So any questions that you have, any individual organizational assistance that you need, please reach out to us. We are happy to be able to help you. And the other thing that I would say is that I consider the trainings I do with all of you, the advocacy trainings, the most important ones that we do. From the bottom of my heart, from one advocate to another, I appreciate the work that you do every single day. And I know how hard it is. And I know that none of you are underworked and overpaid. So thank you for doing what you do on behalf of victims of all types of violence. But huge thank you for working with and identifying and responding to victims of stalking. So what we can do right now